Hello everyone, I'm Michaela Kathleen, and in today's video I'm doing my December reading wrap-up. I read 4 books this month, and the first one I read was Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. I got this book quite a while ago in a subscription box, the Bibliophilic Excursions subscription box, which was one that I really enjoyed, where each month they send you books that are all the same country, and then the products also are from that country. A really cool box. And on this month I got books and products from South Africa. And this is the first book that I have read that was from that box. And it is, of course, a memoir of the comedian Trevor Noah and his time living in South Africa during apartheid, which was kind of South Africa's segregation, and black and white people having children together was illegal, hence the title Born a Crime, because Trevor's mother was black and his father was white. So a really interesting story, very informative. I knew a little bit about South Africa and apartheid, but not a ton, and hearing stories like that, whether it be South Africa's insane laws or America's just not very long before that, is always just crazy. But Noah tells the story with a lot of humor and with a very unique perspective. Obviously, I'm sure there were a fair amount of children who were born a crime like Trevor, but he of course has this now huge platform in which to share his story. And he's a comedian, so he shares it in a really kind of lighthearted way, even though what was going on was really so dark. But he just had such fascinating thoughts and perspectives on obvious things like race, of course, but also less obvious things like language. There are so many different languages in South Africa, and Trevor kind of knew a handful of them, and the way it allowed him to navigate the world was, again, just very interesting. He also had a very unique relationship with both his mom and his dad, kind of especially his dad, but the book at its heart is really about his relationship with his mom, which was so sweet, and there was just such love there that really shines in this book, especially in the final chapter. But the relationship with his dad was especially interesting because obviously he couldn't have a normal relationship with his dad because that was illegal, which again is insanity. But there's this really nice moment where he sees his dad again after not seeing him for a very long time, and his dad has kept this scrapbook of everything Trevor's been doing, and it confirms for Trevor that his dad never stopped caring even though they didn't get to see each other for a long time, and that moment was so sweet. So yeah, really sweet, interesting, funny, but also heavy book that I really have no complaints about other than I wanted more of it. It's a very short book, and I just feel like, I would have liked to know a little bit more about Trevor's kind of rise to being a comedian and kind of that part of his life, but this book was really about his childhood and growing up in South Africa and his mother, so I understand why that wasn't in there, but I just kind of would have liked it. And yeah, I just also wouldn't have minded knowing a little bit more about what ended up happening to some of the people he knew in his early years, some of his friends from his early years, where they ended up. But overall, I really enjoyed this one. It had a very dramatic ending, and it wrapped up nicely and really kind of drove home, I think, kind of what the whole point of the book was, what the book was driving at. And it kind of connected nicely back to the beginning of the book, back to the first chapter. Overall, a really great read, and if he ever writes another memoir that is about later in his life, I think I'll be giving it a read as well. Next, I reread the Jurassic Park duology by Michael Crichton, and I also rewatched the movies. But starting with the first one, Jurassic Park, I read this one for the first time a few years ago, and I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it again on this read. I feel like the book and the movie complement each other really well. It's fun to have both mediums because the book, the action is not as good as in the movie. Obviously, I feel like movies are designed better for action. Also, sometimes with Michael Crichton's writing, the action wasn't very clear in my head. Sometimes I would lose track of where they were, or things just wouldn't make perfect sense during the action sequences. But it did do really a better job of building kind of tension and mystery at the beginning of the story. And the best part was all of the like brainy, sciencey stuff, especially whenever Ian Malcolm is going off on his chaos theory stuff. That all I found really interesting and just is really intelligent writing. It's also interesting to see the differences between the book and the movie. I had forgotten a lot of them, even though I have read it before, but a lot of the characters are quite different in the book. In the book, with the kids, the sister is the younger one, and both of the kids I think are younger in the book than they are in the movie. And then in the book, Grant actually really likes kids, unlike the movie, which obviously it's kind of funnier if he doesn't like kids, because it creates kind of this tension between him and the kids. But in the book he likes kids because kids genuinely like dinosaurs. I feel like the book has a lot more explanation of things, of like how the park runs and the safeguards they've taken to try to make the park run smoothly, even though we all know it doesn't, which was interesting, but it also meant that the plot in the book unravels quite a bit more slowly than in the movie. But honestly, I was just fascinated learning about the functions of the park. The movie trimmed down quite a bit of stuff that was in the book. I feel like the book, with a lot of the kind of things falling apart and dinosaurs getting out and the characters having to try to get to safety, goes a little too far in the book. Like, there's this whole scene where Grant and kids are like canoeing down a river that's just kind of ridiculous. And then the ending is also very different. So spoilers for the ending of the book and the movie. But at the end of the book, John Hammond, the guy who has created the park, ends up dying. And he dies still thinking, ah, what a great park I've created. People will love this. Which is hilarious and I think just so in character, and just really drives the point home of like, sometimes people just don't realize, they just have too much hubris, I think is what I'm trying to say. Whereas in the movie, he survives, and even surviving, he thinks, I shouldn't have created this park. Which, I don't know, I didn't like that change. Malcolm also dies in the book. Crichton magically brings him back to life for the sequel. But in the book, in the first book, truly, he dies. He dies. There are people who argue that there was wiggle room there for him to have survived, and I just don't agree. I think he died, and then Steven Spielberg said, hey, write me another book. Also, this Malcolm character was really popular, and Crichton said, I will bring him back to life. But you know, it's whatever, it's fine. And then another interesting thing that happens at the end of the book that doesn't happen in the movie is Grant and Ellie go to this underground raptor nest, which is ridiculous and silly. But the interesting thing that happens is that they realize that the raptors, because they're the ancestors of birds, want to migrate. And they're hopping on boats and they're doing that. That doesn't really end up having any sort of impact on the sequel, unfortunately, but it was kind of a dramatic ending for the first book that makes you think, ooh, what's gonna happen next? Even though nothing happens next in regards to that plotline. There were also some scenes from the first book that were then put into the second movie. Fun fact. And on that note, I of course next read The Lost World. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this book, Crichton brings Ian Malcolm back from the dead. And his explanation is basically that the news falsely reported Ian Malcolm's death and he really survived the trip to the island. Whatever. I did like the premise for the second book, even though we didn't get the migration storyline. But the premise for this one is that Hammond wasn't really making his dinosaurs on the Jurassic Park island. He was making them on a different island and then shipping them over to that island where everything could look pristine and pretty and like there were no mistakes along the way to the process of creating dinosaurs. It makes sense. And so in this book, there's this rich scientist guy who wants to go find this second island and go study the dinosaurs. Also makes sense. What doesn't make sense is Ian Malcolm deciding to go to this island, even though he literally almost died on the first island. In the movie, they make it make a lot more sense in that he finds out that his girlfriend is already on the island, and he goes there basically as a rescue mission to get her off of the island, not because he's interested in studying the dinosaurs. Because that just makes no sense, not only on the level of he almost died the first time, but also on the level of Malcolm isn't a dinosaur researcher guy. He's a math guy. He didn't go to the first island for the dinosaurs, and he certainly wouldn't go to another one for dinosaurs. And suddenly in the book, he's like kind of a dinosaur expert, which doesn't make sense. So overall, the whole entire everything to do with Ian Malcolm in this book doesn't make sense to me. The Site B premise is good. I like that. But Malcolm being there is boggling. This book overall was, you know, fun. It was okay. It was not as good as the first book, but it was still entertaining. There was some fun feminism thrown in there that I did not expect. Again, I don't really remember these books very well, even though I've read them once before. But yeah, Sarah is total badass. Murders the guy who tried to murder her. Good for her. Overall, her and the little girl, Kelly, are the MVPs of the story. They save the day multiple times. Does Kelly saving the day at the end of the book make a ton of sense? No. But it's still fun. Also, this book, the dinosaur deaths were more interesting in that they were more like make your skin crawl, because it was like, oh, these people are just animals that can be eaten by other animals at any moment. Like especially the part where the guy gets fed to the baby T-Rexes. That part was a little uncomfortable. So yeah, overall, fun to reread this duology. Fun to watch the movies alongside it. Planning to watch all 5, even though there's only the 2 books. I've already watched the first 3. Super excited to rewatch the 4th one soon. So excited we finally got an operational park, even though the whole point of the first book is that that's not possible. Truly what I think we were all waiting for from the very first movie. Don't know why we had to wait until number 4 to get an actual Jurassic Park. And yeah, I have not seen the 5th movie yet, so we'll be excited to watch that for the first time ever soon. But moving on from Jurassic Park to the final read of the month, which was kind of just a little bonus read. I went into the month planning to read those 3, and then I had time at the end for one more little read. So for that one, I went with Dear Martin by Nick Stone, which is just an itty-bitty little book about this teenage boy who is Black, and he, for the first time in his life, deals with some very overt racism from a cop. And that leads him to start this project that he calls Live Like Martin, I'm pretty sure, and he's writing letters to Martin Luther King Jr. This does take place in the present day, so he's not actually sending these letters, of course, but they're just kind of his way of kind of thinking through the events that are happening in his life and trying to think, you know, what would Martin Luther King do in these situations and how can he be more like him? But the story is not told entirely in the letters to Martin. There's regular prose in between the letters, although there are a lot of times where the dialogue, especially at the beginning of the book, is written in like a movie script style almost, which I personally didn't really like. I felt like that made it hard to connect with the characters, and just like there wasn't a ton of character development at the beginning of the book, but that definitely changed. All of the characters ended up being so complex and so layered and interesting. Overall, I would say the first like 50 pages or so was kind of a slow start for me. Sometimes the writing felt a little young. There was the script stuff that was kind of making it hard for me to connect with the characters, but it did definitely pick up. But with such a short book, I'm just sad that the first 50 pages were difficult to connect with, because that only left very few pages left. But it was obviously interesting, heavy topics, and I feel like they were handled really well. And it's amazing in such a short book how many issues that it delved into, and delved into well. Obviously, it dealt with racism and police brutality, but it also dealt with how Black people think about themselves and interact with each other, which was really interesting, and like their own kind of built-in racism. Our main character's mother doesn't want him to date white girls. our main character's best friend is afraid of black girls because he grew up in a very kind of relatively privileged place, and so he thinks of black girls as all hood, and our main character's like, man, that's really messed up. And then another thing that it explores really deeply is our main character, and a lot of the other characters as well, their feeling of like imposter syndrome, which is common for everyone, of feeling like you're not really qualified to do the things that you're doing, or like you didn't earn it or you don't deserve it. But our main character and many of the people around him feel it extra heavily because their white classmates are complaining constantly about like affirmative action and things like that. And so then they just have this extra like weight of feeling like they didn't deserve what they got, even though they know that they worked as hard as all of their classmates to get where they're at, if not harder, because they started in a less privileged position. I really like that none of our characters had all the answers to these things, because it's not like, even if they were given the tools to try to solve all these problems, they wouldn't be able to, because nobody has all the answers to this, and so we all kind of need to work together to make things better. And I think another point of the book is that it's never going to be perfect, but also like it strives to make the point of like, that doesn't mean we should just give up, because even if it can never be perfect, it could be better, and it's going to take everyone for it to be better. I also really liked the romance in this story. I feel like it's really well balanced with the rest of the story. It doesn't like overtake the story, but it's also not just like a non-consequential side plot. It's like actually important to the story. And I just love Justice and SJ so much. And yeah, it had a really good ending. I like how there was a nice mix of characters like getting to have a little bit of redemption and others maybe not so much, but like, again, it felt very real, very realistic. But it'll also be interesting to read the second book and read about a character who didn't get to have the path that Justice got to have with his kind of mostly happy ending, because that is not always, and if anything, that is rarely how it works out. So it was nice to have this kind of inspiring, overall happy-ish ending, but now in the next book we'll get to have a different perspective. So yeah, overall really interesting read. Again, interesting. great character development, very nuanced story. So yeah, these were the 4 books that I read in December. Let me know down below what books you ended the year off with. And now on to the quote for today's video, which today I have one from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and it is said by Dumbledore. And it goes, "Most human beings do have a knack of choosing precisely those things that are worst for them." Thanks for watching. Remember, words matter.